Hello, I'm Arthur Kent. Welcome to History Undercover. At the height of the Civil War, a Washington newspaper complained about widespread prostitution in the nation's capital, where an estimated 5,000 ladies were marketing their services to Union soldiers. Down south, Nashville was described as a magnet for wayward women and a breeding ground for disease. In other words, yes, there was sex during the Civil War, a subject that has been thoroughly documented by author and physician Thomas Lowry. Our program, inspired by Lowry's research, peeks beneath the covers of both the blue and the gray. Join us as History Undercover presents Sex in the Civil War.
Was she a strumpet or a spy?
She seemed to like the generals.
It was a war where winning a battle and capturing a city was only half the fight.
The army was confronted with a social enemy that threatened its very existence, the women of the town.
Some women wrote love letters that could make a soldier blush.
They were pouring out their deepest feelings, and these were often sexual feelings.
Others spread maladies which made the bravest men cringe.
Syphilis was usually treated with salts of mercury.
A night with Venus, a lifetime with Mercury.
These are the stories the soldiers wouldn't tell. The untold stories of sex in the Civil War. It is the most popular, most widely discussed, most hotly debated, most passionately revered era in American history. We know all about the glorious battles, the godlike generals, the epic struggles of citizens and soldiers, the freedom of a people, and the martyring of a president. But what about life when the lights went out?
It's something that they might have talked amongst themselves or whispered, but a proper Victorian person would not have written it down because it was a taboo subject.
Sex. It happened a lot.
This was a big, vigorous, red-blooded, brawling country, and everybody was raising hell, and nobody made any bones about it.
More than 50,000 books have been written about the Civil War, and yet hardly a peep about sex. Only one book, in fact, deals directly and exclusively with the topic and reveals the secrets that have long been hidden in history's closet.
Somehow the Civil War has become our holy war, and nobody did anything bad in it. And there has been an enormous amount of revisionist history in which the Civil War has been sanitized, has been made into a religious experience.
In our written history, it was an era of gallant gentlemen, proper ladies, and a romanticized ideal of love. Social behavior reflected the mores of America's Puritan heritage. And in this vein, the official record has been thoroughly cleansed.
The idea that somehow the people in the Victorian age were more constrained than we are, it was probably the other way around. The availability of women of easy virtue, who went under many different names, were everywhere. And the soldiers discovered this very quickly when they got away from home.
In the spring and summer of 1861, the political fireworks that caused Southern secession and the attack on Fort Sumter seemed born of glory and excitement. The young people who went to war had no earthly idea what to expect. Most had never been more than 20 miles from home, never ridden a train or a steamboat. For them, this was the great adventure of their lives. But the reality of war set in quickly. It was, as they say, 99% boredom and 1% pure, unadulterated hell. On the battlefield, soldiers were true heroes. But behind the lines, boys were boys and girls were girls.
Many of the boys had never had a drink of alcohol, much less gamble of any type. And they soon found out in these army camps that it was could be a very sinful place, to say the least.
It's a slang term that has endured for 150 years. The origin can be traced to 1845, but without question it was popularized and indelibly etched on the American mind because of the Civil War and a notorious Union general.
General Joseph Fighting Joe Hooker. As one gentleman would later write, that Hooker's headquarters was a place where no self-respecting man would want to go and no decent woman could go. It was a combination of bar room and brothel.
In May 1861, Joseph Hooker was appointed Brigadier General of Volunteers and assigned to defend Washington, D.C. With new recruits arriving every day, a gathering army of anxious, excited young men soon found Washington's hidden pleasures.
The saloons were very near the houses that held the ladies of ill fame, the Wayward Sisters. Pretty soon, some would, as they call, go down the line, as the soldiers said. In many cases, it was the initiation of a new recruit to go down the line and visit the ladies of the evening. Some of these bordellos were called Fort Sumter, the Ironclad Headquarters, USA, Madam Russell's Bake Oven, and Madam Walton's Residence for the Ladies. These became very famous for the soldiers of the Federal Army, and just about everyone knew about these homes.
After the First Battle of Bull Run, fought in July 1861, there were more than 100,000 Union soldiers camped in and around Washington, with at least 450 brothels to entertain them. And most were conveniently located between the Capitol and the White House. Fighting Joe Hooker did little to stop his troops from visiting such establishments. In fact, some think he made it easier.
When Hooker was head of the Army of the Potomac, he got the military police to move the girls more into one neighborhood, probably for better supervision, better police work. And the newspapers immediately called that Hooker's division. And so Hooker and hookers have always been associated in the public mind.
There was a European tradition of families going to war with the soldiers, supporters of the army, called vivandières and cantinières. And it was an acceptable occupation, indeed a necessary occupation, because they cooked for the armies, they did the laundry for the army, and they kept the men ready to fight. Other women, of course, went because they saw an opportunity to prostitute themselves. Interestingly, historians make much of the prostitutes in camp and tend to ignore the thousands of women that were there nursing and sewing and doing the laundry. The term camp follower during the Civil War was not a derogatory term.
In August 1861, a 17-year-old orphan left Cambridge, Massachusetts to go to Washington and be a nurse for the Union Army. The Army turned her down. With no real place to call home, she became a camp follower. First, she somehow finagled a pass from a prominent general, John Ellis Wool. Then she went to the front. There, she quickly worked her way up the Union ranks, enjoying the company of officers. Her name was Annie Jones. This may or may not be a photograph of Annie Jones. Because of her elusive nature, we don't really know what she looked like. But we know what she did.
The officers would let her come into their camp. You place her in a tent, or she stayed with the officers in their quarters, 17 years old.
Annie Jones became a poster child for sex in the Civil War. She was somewhat of a Union Army groupie, the original good time girl. And over the next 4 years, her antics would create a legacy of rumor, innuendo, and scandal. In the winter of 1862, Abraham Lincoln ordered the entire Union Army to attack the enemy at once. The only general to move with alacrity was Ulysses S. Grant. By February, the future hero of Vicksburg and Appomattox had won his first major battle and captured most of the state of Tennessee.
After the fall of Fort Donelson, February 16, 1862, 9 days later, the city of Nashville became the occupied city, and the stars and stripes were raised over the state capitol. And in time, 30,000 federal soldiers occupied the city of Nashville. And of course, monotony being the great enemy of any soldier, pretty soon they made their way down by the river to Front Market, College and Cherry Street, now 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th Avenue, and broke their monotony by visiting Smoky Row.
Before the war, the city of Nashville had become known as the Athens of the South. It was a major commercial center where railroads and steamboats converged.
Rivaling the commerce was the industry of the mind. It was a mecca for education, religion, and publishing. All this brought prestige to the city. But down by the river, there was a different industry. 2 blocks wide, 4 blocks long. Prostitution, 8 full blocks of it.
Here on the banks of the Cumberland River, the shadow industry along Smoky Row thrived under Union occupation.
Nashville became a major staging area, and it filled up with soldiers, and right after that it filled up with women.
Many of these ladies were not evil, they were not mean. They were country girls or ladies down on their luck, or they had children and their husbands that died or left them or whatever, and that was the only alternative they had to literally sell themselves to keep their families alive.
Well, we all know the Victorian age was famous for euphemisms. The newspapers often referred to these girls as soiled doves. Doves are pure and white, and of course they're soiled and they're kind of nasty. They were also called Cyprians. The island of Cyprus is where Aphrodite, the Greek goddess of love, was born. So these girls became Cyprians.
Under martial law, prostitution was rampant in Nashville. This lascivious behavior had its consequences, and the effects proved more harmful to Union soldiers than any rebel attack.
At one point, there were more men sick with venereal disease than there were sick, from Confederate bullets. And it became a huge public health and military efficiency problem.
Near cities, there was no way to prevent soldiers from visiting brothels and risking infection. In Nashville, 2 out of every 5 soldiers contracted VD, and medical remedies were crude.
Syphilis was usually treated with salts of mercury, which had been in use for almost 200 years and apparently did some good for it, although the follow-up studies were very poor. Unfortunately, the mercury compounds are almost as toxic as the disease. You could tell when a person had about the right amount of it when they would salivate uncontrollably and their teeth would fall out. So it wasn't a good remedy. The treatments for gonorrhea included changes in diet and some very painful irrigations. The syringe was filled with chloride of lead and inserted into the unfortunate soldier, and this toxic solution inserted. And the prescription book for this says that most people can tolerate this dosage without screaming. I commend it to male readers to empathize with this procedure.
Treatments notwithstanding, the rising incidence of VD among men and women prompted a call to action. Throughout 1862, Army officials waged an undeclared war against the wayward sisters of Nashville. It would be a long struggle with many heated battles and eventually a unique truce that would have lasting consequences for the Union Army and the city of Nashville. While most women, prostitutes or not, spent the war in cities and towns far behind the battle lines, some found the lure of love too much to resist.
A number of women were so in love and so determined to stay with their husbands or their boyfriends that they decided to enlist as soldiers. And in order to do that, they had to pretend to be men. So they cut off their hair and they put on their husband's clothes and they would bind their breasts, and some of them would pad the waists of their trousers to look bulkier.
These women soldiers enlisted under assumed male names, duping officers and comrades alike. If found out, they were usually sent away, sometimes under the worst accusations.
Oftentimes, bona fide women soldiers, when they were found out to be women, were accused of being prostitutes. It was a common charge leveled against women found in uniform.
While not all of these women followed the Army for love and sex, many found it nonetheless and managed to keep it secret, at least for a while. One such woman was a corporal in the Army of the Potomac. Her name is lost to history, but what she did is well documented. Pretending to be a man, she fought in the battles of Antietam and Fredericksburg and was promoted on the field for gallantry.
In the winter camp of the Army of the Potomac there on the banks of the Rappahannock, she was out on picket and wasn't feeling so well. And she was sent to a hospital and she delivered a baby. She had concealed not only the fact that she was a woman, but the fact that she was pregnant. The reaction of the Army of the Potomac was shock and surprise and joy.
At least 6 Union soldiers were not discovered to be women until they delivered babies. Many other women were not discovered at all and remained in the ranks throughout the war. And then there were those who didn't have to conceal their identities and were welcomed with open arms. In October 1862, after the devastating summer campaign that culminated in the Bloodfest at Antietam, young, attractive Annie Jones wandered into the Federal Army camp surrounding Fairfax Courthouse, Virginia. There she befriended Union Army General Franz Sigel and became a guest at his headquarters. For her duty, Annie, now all of 18 years old, was rewarded with honorary oak leaves, the insignia of a major. But it wasn't long before she left Sigel for the tent of another Union general, Julius Stahl. Major Annie Jones, it turned out, had a thing for generals. What followed was a series of peccadillos and sexual exploits which would land Annie and her conquests in a lot of hot water. By January 1863, the war between the states had raged for 20 months. But in Union-occupied Northern Virginia, a war between the sheets had just begun.
Miss Anna Jones. This is an incredible story. They left 6 federal generals in her wake. Was she a spy? Was she a prostitute? One thing is for sure, many of these officers were not gentlemen.
All winter long, Annie Jones had enjoyed the company of 2 Union generals, Franz Sigel and Julius Stahl, and moved freely between their camps. Early in the war, civilians were often given passes to move between the lines. But in Annie's case, suspicion arose. Northern Virginia was, after all, enemy country. So why did this young girl have permission to come and go as she pleased? On January 13th, a Union general received a letter from one R.L. Birch of Falls Church, Virginia, accusing Annie Jones of being a rebel spy. Annie was immediately arrested, masked, and taken to the old Capitol Prison in Washington, where she was held, pending a full inquiry. Between January and March, Annie's case was investigated by a Lieutenant Shepard from the Provost Marshal's office. In his official report, he stated that it was a very amusing investigation on the whole. The inquiry revealed Annie's true motive, a girl looking for a good time. That in turn led Shepard to discover something about Annie's accuser. In his report, Shepard said, "The letter containing the charges was evidently written by a female who is jealous of her, as her former lover is paying some attention to this Miss Jones. And I found she was very anxious to have this Miss Jones out of the way." Shepard then concluded that Miss Annie Jones had been wrongfully accused. Annie was released from prison on March 7, 1863, and without missing a beat, she went straight to Fairfax Courthouse, where she allegedly attended a notorious party. Fairfax Courthouse was the headquarters for Brigadier General Edwin Stoughton. He was a promising 24-year-old officer who also liked the ladies. On the night of March 8th, Stoughton hosted a champagne party, got drunk and passed out in bed, allegedly in the company of Annie Jones. Several hours later, in the pre-dawn darkness, there was a knock at the general's door. An unknown officer burst through, grabbed the snoring general's sword, and spanked him on the buttocks. The intruder asked the general if he'd ever heard of Mosby, the notorious gray ghost of the Confederacy. "Yes," said Stoughton, "I know Mosby. Have you caught him?" And to that, the officer replied, "No, I am Mosby, and I have caught you." General Stoughton was now a prisoner of war, and Mosby was a Southern hero. Annie Jones apparently slipped away that night, but rumors soon circulated that a young woman had aided Mosby with information about Stoughton. A month later, under renewed suspicions, Annie signed an affidavit swearing she would stay north of the Potomac River. It was a pledge she'd keep for at least a month, maybe 2. Meanwhile, back in Nashville, military officials had more to worry about than one oversexed teenager and her conquests. A public health crisis plagued the Union Army. 40% of the occupying force had contracted VD. Something had to be done.
The commander tried several tactics. The first, he tried putting 1,000 prostitutes on a train and selling them to Louisville. Well, they didn't ask the people in Louisville about this. And while these girls were out of town, more girls came in. So when the girls that went to Louisville came back, they had twice as many girls as they had before.
With the Army's delicate problem nearing epidemic proportions, another desperate attempt was made to rid the town of the Cyprians.
The problem was given over to Lieutenant Colonel George Spaulding, 18th Michigan, Provost Marshal. And he placed the ladies, some say 150, some say 600, somewhere in that range. The most vile character, placed them on the steamboat. The boat was named the Idaho.
The Idaho was a brand new passenger ship, owned and captained by a river pilot named John Newcomb. For his maiden voyage, he had chartered the steamboat to the U.S. Army, expecting to ship troops and supplies between Cincinnati and Nashville. Imagine his surprise when he was told of his particular cargo.
Captain Newcomb was enraged. This was a new boat, a passenger ship with new furniture. And he said it would ruin his ship. There was other old boats in the areas that could perform the duties.
Newcomb's protests fell on deaf ears. He wasn't even given any money or provisions, just was ordered to cast off and proceed to Louisville.
And here we start on this journey on the Cumberland River, moving, and in every stop, the towns have been warned. With the ladies' encouragement, the men of the towns would try to get on the boat.
The people of Louisville refused to accept the boat's passengers, so the Idaho was redirected to Cincinnati. Same result. Finally, after waiting in the middle of the Ohio River for 10 hot July days, Newcomb was ordered back to Nashville. By the time he returned, his brand new steamboat was a mess, a den of squalor.
His boat was damaged severely, and he said the reputation had been ruined, and in fact it was now called the floating whorehouse.
With the return of the Idaho and its undesirable cargo, the military government of Nashville was stumped. Nothing had been solved.
And at this point, the commander threw up his hands and turned to his chief doctor and said, "You do something about it." And to his great credit, he did.
On August 20th, 1863, the U.S. military commander in Nashville did something drastic. He legalized prostitution.
In a memorandum, he outlined that the ladies would be registered with their names and residence, and a board examiner would test them every 2 weeks to make sure of their cleanliness at a fee of $5. And if they were sick, diseased, they were sent to the hospital.
2 Army hospitals were designated to isolate and treat those found to be infected with VD.
Well, it's my understanding that hospital number 11 was the hospital for women. And there is a famous photo which shows white women doing the laundry. And that almost confirms it, because at that time in Nashville, white women didn't do laundry.
The men's infirmary was hospital number 15, known as the Soldiers' Syphilitic Hospital.
As one doctor said, the purpose of the former, the ladies' hospital, was to diminish the individuals in the latter, which was the soldiers' hospital.
While medical treatments for VD remained crude and primitive, quarantining the afflicted proved to be very effective.
They reduced the VD rate to about 4% from 40%. Even more girls came into town because the word spread that you could go there and stay well and be well treated, and you wouldn't get sick and die from VD. And it made money because they charged a license fee to the girls, and that was enough to cover the whole cost of the project.
So in essence, Nashville has the dubious distinction of being the first city in America to have legalized prostitution. And believe it or not, it was successful.
The Civil War produced an enormous body of letters, diaries, and memoirs. Most that survive tell of the battles, leaders, and campaigns. Some reveal personal odysseys and civic issues. Very few concern sex.
Sex was still very much something that was private, and even with a courting couple, it was something very much to be enjoyed but kept quiet. There was still a certain reticence and shyness about overt sexuality.
It's not that people didn't write about sex. They did. But after the war, the most titillating letters and diaries were heavily edited or destroyed.
The published editions are often expunged. They've often been censored. Families didn't want such personal and private and possibly salacious materials to be in print.
I would imagine that 99% of the salacious material from the Civil War has been destroyed. If it wasn't destroyed by the soldier, if after he died and his spinster daughter is going through his papers to edit the memoirs of Colonel so-and-so and finds this stuff, it would go in the fireplace in 2 seconds.
And yet some documents survive. Most common are those lamenting the debauchery of the Army camps. But here and there, letters exist describing love and its physical rights. A rare few detail sexual antics in explicit terms, such as the Union soldier who wrote home telling about 2 sisters who are rentable for riding. Another related that the boys are having great times with the wenches here today, catching them and squeezing them. Some explicit letters were penned by women. One in particular wrote some very steamy prose to her soldier husband. She said, "My mind dwells on the treasures we will have when you come back, embracing each other on the sofa and bed. I never felt so good as I did the first time I laid on the sofa."
Husbands and wives were husbands and wives. There's lots of love letters which are quite explicit. The wife would write to the husband, "You've got to get a furlough and come home, and I want to do it on the sofa again with you."
More often, writers employed the playful euphemisms of the Victorian age. One such passage may be found in the famous Civil War memoir, Company H, written by Confederate Private Sam Watkins of Tennessee.
There's a portion of the book, Company H, where they're in Georgia, and they visit a home where they're fed. And it goes like this. If I'd had a better supper than that, I'd forgotten it. They had fried chicken, potatoes, butter, regular butter. And to cap the climax, 2 handsome daughters. I know that I have never seen 2 more handsome daughters. Well, they looked good enough to eat. Pretty soon our plates were filled with tempting food and our tumblers with California beer. Finally, the lady said, "Mr. Have some butter." He said, "Well, madam, there's nothing I love so much as warm biscuit and butter. I thank you for the butter." I dive in. I go at it a little too heavy. The lady hinted in a delicate way that they sold butter. I dive in again. The cake of butter was melting like snow in a red hot furnace. The lady said they sold butter to the soldiers at a mighty good price. I dive in again. And the lady said, "I get $1 a pound for that butter." And I remarked with a good deal of nonchalance, "Well, madam, it is worth it."
In his memoir, Sam Watkins states as a fact that he did not buy any butter. But while he dined in Georgia with a farmer's daughter, Annie Jones was back in Northern Virginia, violating her sacred oath. After the Battle of Gettysburg, Annie had somehow become acquainted with General Gouverneur K. Warren. He gave her a pass, which she used to go to a Union cavalry camp. Once there, she quickly added 2 more generals to her bonnet. The first was Judson Kilpatrick, a known womanizer.
Judson, who was also known as Kill Cavalry because of his wild and brutal tactics in killing off his soldiers, liked women, and he always had at least 1 or 2 traveling with him, who were mistresses or consorts or concubines, whatever you want to call them.
Apparently, Annie didn't stay with Kilpatrick very long, because she soon found the camp and allegedly the tent of Kilpatrick's dashing subordinate, General George Armstrong Custer. According to Annie, General Kilpatrick became very jealous of General Custer's attentions, went to General Meade's headquarters and accused her of being a rebel spy. For the second time, she was arrested, masked, and thrown in jail. In her own defense, Annie wrote a searing statement. She named names and leveled charges of her own. She accused the prison superintendent of soliciting sexual favors and said that the chief of the Secret Service, Colonel Lafayette Baker, had a vendetta against her. To answer the charges, George Custer, who had recently become engaged to his future wife, was ordered to submit a statement. Somewhat reluctantly, Custer admitted knowing Annie Jones, but he denied sleeping with her.
Custer would deny all of it, said she was insane, and he sent her away. And this is not true about him and Kilpatrick. One doubts the truth to this story.
To his credit, Custer said he didn't think that Annie was a spy, but she was not immediately released, and so Miss Jones took her case to the highest level.
In a letter to Abraham Lincoln, no less, she would write that I have never violated my parole. I am an orphan and an unprotected girl, the victim of fiendish malice.
Lincoln immediately requested the evidence in the case. Soon after, Annie Jones wrote to a prominent congressman from New York, Fernando Wood, asking for his help as well. By July, the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, was involved. At Lincoln's request, Stanton wrote Congressman Wood, saying that Annie Jones would be released to his custody. Stanton added that he hoped the congressman might exercise sufficient influence over her to keep her away from the Army. But the congressman's influence had little effect. By August 1864, Annie Jones was back in camp once more.
We have 6 federal generals left in her wake. It is a very amusing story that many officers would later regret meeting Miss Anna Jones.
In the hallowed lore of the Civil War, one might assume that most of the published literature of the day was either patriotic or religious. But what may surprise people is that a lot of it was patently pornographic.
This was hardly a period where sex was invisible. It was quite readily visible on city streets and in towns across America.
Well, I was amazed to find that during the Civil War in the city of New York, there was an enormous industry publishing pornography. And they would send out their catalogs in the usual plain manila envelopes to the soldiers.
From dirty jokes and bawdy songbooks to tawdry pulp fiction and naughty French postcards, soldiers had plenty to choose from. But understandably, the dirty books and pictures are very rare today.
They were quickly destroyed, especially before they went into battle. They did not want to die with that on them. It was a sin to see that or to look at that. Nonetheless, they did circulate.
When Civil War era pornography is discovered, it's usually by accident. Consider a most holy book containing the most unholy drawings. This extraordinary Civil War Bible belonged to an unknown soldier. Today, it resides in an anonymous collection. This is the first time it has ever been publicly shown. The Bible was found about 30 years ago in the rubble of a raised brick building in downtown Nashville. It is thought that the building might have been the infamous Hospital No. 15, the soldiers' syphilitic hospital. The front of the Bible is like any other pocket testament. But open the back cover, and a soldier's secret is revealed. First, a braid of hair, carefully stitched onto an end page. There's nothing startling about this. Such keepsakes were common in that era. But some numbers are written around the braid: 75, 76, 67. It seems to be a code. Turn the page, and the code is explicitly revealed. In crude fashion, the soldier who carried this Bible drew two lewd pictures inside the back cover. Around the pictures are dollar signs, and the numerical codes matching those around the braid of hair. It's believed that the pictures and the code may refer to one of Nashville's own soiled doves. Perhaps the soldier was in love with a prostitute.
It is so rare to find any soldier's drawings of nudes. It's just unbelievably rare. And to have drawings of nudes in the back of the holy book is blasphemous.
In March 1865, while Ulysses S. Grant was closing the vise on Robert E. Lee, a letter arrived in the office of the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton. The author was none other than the vixen of the Union Army, Annie Jones. In it, she requested a pass to go to New Orleans. But the most unusual thing about the letter, which Stanton humorously noted, was the return address. It was the residence of the Honorable New York Congressman Fernando Wood. The war ended soon after, and so apparently did the adventures of Miss Anna Eleanor Jones.
No one really knows what came of Anna Jones. As far as I know, she disappeared. She went back to Massachusetts. Maybe she married. Many changed their names.
The end of the war brought many changes. In Nashville, the military government gave way to civilian authority, and thus ended the U.S. Army's successful experiment with legalized prostitution. In modern Washington, there's little physical evidence of the bawdy culture that once dominated. But for those who are curious, it's easy to trace the steps of soldiers and politicians who once sought carnal pleasure in the nation's capital.
If you go to the cafeteria in the basement of the main art museum of the Smithsonian, you'll be right where Marble Alley was. If you go out the other way and start off toward the White House, the first building is the Justice Department building, and there were half a dozen whorehouses there. The next building over is the IRS building, and people are still receiving the same treatment now as they did then there. Go where the Reagan building is now, the same thing. So there was a whole industry located conveniently between the White House and the Congress.
Today, on the National Mall, there are numerous monuments dedicated to the glory and sacrifice of America's greatest heroes, with more planned for the future. But will we ever see an edifice erected to the stories the soldiers wouldn't tell? The unmentionable history of sex in the Civil War.
General Joseph Hooker, who concentrated prostitution in one area of Washington, had a distinguished military career, eventually commanding the Army of the Potomac. The officer he replaced was General Ambrose Burnside, and purely by coincidence, both men left a permanent mark on the English language. Burnside wore distinctive whiskers that came to be known as sideburns. And Joseph Hooker will always be associated with the world's oldest profession.
was a time of bloodshed, deprivation, and suffering. It was also a time of sexual excess and carnal indulgence. Well-respected officers became embroiled in notorious scandals.
The general was known as a rake. He had had weakness with women.
Vice became big business.
You could buy pornographic pictures. You could buy pornographic novels.
And soldiers found refuge in back alley brothels.
When the Union soldiers took over New Orleans, sex was everywhere. Prostitutes were everywhere.
These are the untold stories of the war between the sheets. The further tales of sex in the Civil War. Next. The Civil War was America's holy war. History depicts it as an era when ordinary citizens put aside personal aspirations to risk their lives for a cause most believed was greater than themselves. But behind this noble facade, real human beings existed. Young men and women with the same emotional and physical desires that consume people today. For those who fought in the Civil War, sex provided a welcome escape from its horrors.
They were afraid, they were anxious, they were unsure of what was going to happen. They wanted to fight for their country and for what they believed in, but they also know there was a good possibility that they weren't coming back. So they were going to make sure that their last minutes on Earth, they were going to have a good time.
It began on April 12, 1861. Confederate artillery opened fire on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. After 34 hours of shelling, the Union defenders surrendered. The shocking attack cemented the split between northern and southern states along political, economic, and military lines. When it came to sex, however, wide-ranging differences had already been defined. Not by politics, but by class.
Moralists and televangelists are always telling us that we're living in an era of Sodom and Gomorrah and loose morals and falling family values. But I think the evidence, which has been concealed for many years, is that it's much more open during the Civil War than it is now.
This somewhat surprising attitude towards sex was most prevalent in America's working-class communities.
The working classes had a very different attitude about sex than the middle and upper classes did. They were raised differently. They were raised in very crowded areas. They saw often their parents having sex because they lived in one-room areas, so they weren't as put off by sex as the middle class was. It wasn't as scary to them because they understood it from a very young age.
For the most part, the working-class female did not deny her sexuality. Premarital sex was fairly common. If a woman got pregnant, she was expected to marry the father. To prevent pregnancy, various methods of contraception were available.
The Civil War pornography catalogs usually had several different types of condoms for sale, including French ticklers. There were many, many ads for abortion clinics and abortion powders.
This is a vaginal syringe. This was used for women for douching, or more often than not, it was a form of birth control. Sometimes it was filled with whiskey, sometimes it was filled with lemon juice, sometimes it was a mixture of other things. The idea was to remove the sperm from your body. The woman would fill the syringe by unscrewing this, pouring it inside, and then she would inject herself with it, preferably immediately after sex, because it didn't work well if you waited too long.
Avoiding pregnancy was perhaps less of a concern for unmarried women in the middle and upper classes, who tended to have fewer premarital encounters. More often than not, their sexual behavior was influenced by a puritanical code of religious and social constraints.
It was either the virgin or the whore. So young women who did engage in sexual activities were considered fallen women, were considered damaged marital goods, and might therefore not be able to make a good marriage unless it was with the man that she had had the sexual relationship with before marriage.
On the other side of the sexual divide, men were not expected to abstain from sex. Quite the opposite, in fact.
Young men were expected to be experienced at sex, but not with women that they intended to marry. So they had to find their own sexual experience through visiting brothels or through having sexual experiences with young girls that weren't of their class.
It was kind of understood that there would be women who, young men particularly who were not married, could go to satisfy their sexual hunger. It was understood even in the best families. In fact, sometimes best families encourage their sons rather than spur on the women that they might marry to seek the pleasure of fallen women.
And seek they did. Just before the war broke out, the poet Walt Whitman estimated that 19 out of every 20 males living in New York City visited brothels on a regular basis. The price of illegal sexual services varied. An encounter with a common streetwalker typically cost $1, while a high-class woman of pleasure might charge $5 to $7 per visit. Prostitutes in the mid-19th century tended to be fairly young and from the lower working classes. With few economic avenues available, these women often sold their bodies as a way to supplement their income. With the outbreak of war, this open, big city attitude toward sex would spread through the ranks of soldiers fighting on both sides.
During any war, standards of behavior go. A soldier who was living in a small town before the war, the people kept track of him. His mother kept track of him, his sisters kept track of him, his employer kept track of him. The local sheriff knew what he was up to. And when you go in the Army, you become anonymous. You're just one more guy in a blue uniform.
New York City served as a major recruiting site for Union volunteers. For many of these troops, the time spent in New York was their last hurrah before heading off to war.
They had nothing to do other than drill, and when they had time off, they usually drank heavily and almost always got involved with a woman at some point or another. They'd go to concert saloons like Harry Hill's, which was very well known in New York City. They'd go to a dump like John Allen's dance hall if they were interested in the lower class. They could go to the place called the Armory Hall, which was run by a guy named Billy McLaury. He not only offered very young girls for sale at this dance hall, he also had effeminate young boys dressed as women.
In the city's fashionable Soho district, a collection of stylish brothels catered to the more discriminating and wealthy officer corps.
You didn't just go there for sex, you went there to be entertained. The women were very accomplished, they were very educated, they sang. It was a whole evening you spent there to be entertained, from dinner and singing and dancing and smoking and drinking, right up to eventually having sex.
But consorting with prostitutes was hardly unique to the Union Army. Down in Dixie, the war soon revealed that the image of the chivalrous Southern gentleman was sometimes just that, an image. Nowhere was this more evident than in Richmond, Virginia. It was one of the South's most beautiful and important cities. Its status was reflected in its designation as the capital of the Confederacy in May of 1861. But in a matter of months, everything changed. Newly arriving soldiers and political figures swelled Richmond's population from under 40,000 to over 100,000. Large military encampments sprouted up in and around the new Confederate capital. Prior to the war, it was socially improper for an unmarried Richmond woman to visit alone with a man. Now, with the ready availability of so many soldiers, the temptation proved hard to resist.
One 16-year-old woman who kept a diary during the early years of the war reported a lot of activity back and forward visiting the camps during one 3-week period in the spring of 1862. She entertained Confederate soldiers who visited her in her home on 3 or 4 separate occasions during that time, and then also made visits to camp, and on one occasion even visited a soldier's private quarters.
But bold, starry-eyed girls were not the only females to frequent the camps.
Guys bring women into camp and introduce them as their wives, and they're really prostitutes. And they're known in the community as prostitutes, and they have these women stay in the camp with them.
Elsewhere, in Richmond's stately mansions, the sexual dance was more subtle. Flirtatious debutantes delighted in entertaining the many Southern officers stationed in the city.
They threw parties frequently when officers were in town. They conducted amateur theatricals. They escorted different officers to church every week, did the best they could to keep up the spirits, make themselves highly visible among the officer corps of the Confederate Army.
One of Richmond's most desirable debutantes was Sally Buchanan Preston, whom friends called Buck. Vivacious and beautiful, she was just 17 when the war commenced, and as it progressed, she would cast a spell over one suitor after another.
Sally Buck Preston was attached in many different episodes to different officers. In fact, I think it's pretty safe to conclude she was a flirt, at the very least, and had relationships with probably a half dozen different officers, some of them prominent and famous, others of them not so famous.
Sally's sex appeal was undeniable and irresistible. A close friend described her as having a knack for being fallen in love with at sight and for having never been fallen out of love with. But this power over the opposite sex carried a price and would soon cast a dark shadow over the young debutante and the men who desired her. Early in 1862, President Abraham Lincoln and his military command initiated a plan to create an economic stranglehold on the Confederate States. Along the eastern seaboard, the Union Navy instituted a blockade to deny the South access to European trade. At the same time, a combined force of naval and army units descended upon the Mississippi River. In February of 1862, the plan began to unfold when Union troops captured Nashville, Tennessee. Then, on April 25th, the Union Navy, led by Flag Officer David G. Farragut, overwhelmed the Confederate defenses and captured New Orleans. With a population of over 170,000, New Orleans was the largest city in the Confederacy. The Union Army assigned roughly 15,000 soldiers to the job of maintaining control. New Orleans was widely regarded as the sin capital of the South. Long before the war, hedonistic pirates and riverboat gamblers had created a pleasure seekers' playground of cheap saloons and back alley brothels. For the boys in blue, many still fresh from farms or small towns, New Orleans was an eye-opening experience.
When the Union soldiers took over New Orleans, sex was everywhere. Prostitutes were everywhere. It was an accepted part of New Orleans society. The streetwalkers, they would actually carry around little small pieces of rugs. When they found a customer, they just threw the rug out on the street, and they would have sex right there on the street.
In the notorious French Quarter, there was also plenty of indoor entertainment.
The dance halls in New Orleans were almost always lower class. Women usually started out almost naked while they were dancing with their partners, and by the end of the night, they'd be doing everything else on the dance floor but dancing. In other cities, that was not an acceptable practice. You usually didn't practice prostitution on the premises.
The city's loose sexual standards proved irresistible to the Union troops. Even an official military ban on prostitution had little effect.
These guys were mostly in their early 20s, in their absolute, height of the sexual tickle. They had money in their pocket, which most people didn't. They were being followed by girls who needed the money. It would be amazing if there weren't more misbehavior along this line.
The Union Army's first military commander in New Orleans was Major General Benjamin Butler. He quickly earned the wrath of local residents. First, he defiled the city's famed statue of Andrew Jackson by having it etched with the words, "The Union must and shall be preserved." Then, Butler ordered a Confederate sympathizer hanged for tearing down a Union flag.
He felt that if I am tough at the beginning, it will prevent any outbreak of violence by the civilian population, which will result in even more people being home.
To his surprise, Butler met continued resistance, not so much from the city's male population, but from its upper-class women. These respectable Southern ladies antagonized the federal troops by spitting at them and pouring urine-filled chamber pots on their heads. As an ironic and supreme insult, they were said to have flashed their genitalia at surprised Northern officers.
At that point in time, women had no political power. And so they figured that they could get away with saying and doing really uncouth things, but nobody would do anything bad to them because they were ladies.
General Butler did not want to cause a riot or insurrection by arresting society ladies. Instead, he took the unusual step of issuing Order Number 28, famously known as the Woman's Order.
Essentially what it says is, if you women of New Orleans calling yourselves ladies continue to behave in this way, you'll be liable to be treated as a woman of the town plying your avocation. And so essentially what he threatens to do is make these respectable Southern women into public women so that they can be treated in the same way that prostitutes are treated. And this is enormously controversial.
Butler's threat to detain and imprison the city's society ladies as common streetwalkers made him a hated man, not only in New Orleans, but across the entire South. Confederate President Jefferson Davis declared Butler an outlaw, and a Southern newspaper even put a price on his head. But in the end, Butler's infamous Order Number 28 did work. The fear of a soiled reputation was enough to prevent any more acts of defiance.
The Confederates have been furious about this ever since. They claim that it was abuse. What he did was to stop the problem without firing a shot or arresting anyone. And I think what they're furious about is the fact that he outfoxed them.
On June 6, 1862, another major port city along the Mississippi River fell to the Union Navy, Memphis, Tennessee. The following month, federal troops led by General William Tecumseh Sherman entered and occupied the city. Although the official policy of the U.S. military prohibited soldiers from visiting prostitutes, Sherman spent little time enforcing this regulation. He considered prostitution to be a private matter and not within his military jurisdiction. This only served to encourage any Union soldier looking to spend his money. Federal troops earned on average $13 per month. Prostitutes typically charged anywhere from $1 or $2 for a quick visit to over $3 for an all-night affair. Unlike in New Orleans, there were not enough prostitutes in Memphis to satisfy demand. Consequently, women of pleasure from neighboring areas flocked to the city to ply their trade.
They knew the guys were there. They knew they had nothing to do on their off time. They knew they were away from their families and their wives and their girlfriends. And they knew they wanted sex, so they went to where the men were.
While many of these soiled doves continued to sympathize with the Confederacy, wartime conditions forced them to consort with the enemy. One soldier described this dichotomy.
The women damn Yankee us on the streets in the daytime, but at night the skirts come up for good Yankee gold.
In November of 1862, General Sherman moved on to his next campaign and left Memphis in control of a standing army of occupation. As with any occupying army, the enemy now was boredom. And one way to alleviate boredom was sex. Consequently, contact between prostitutes and Union soldiers increased, along with the incidence of venereal disease. As the situation worsened, federal commanders in Tennessee would be forced to undertake a radical course of action. And by all accounts, it would work. For the thousands of Civil War soldiers living in military encampments, letters to and from home provided a welcome distraction from wartime duties.
People, when they wrote home to their mother, to their sister, they wrote one kind of letter. When they wrote home to friends, their male friends back home, the letters are mostly content which couldn't be read out loud on family television. They were very graphic. They were full of drawings like you might see in a men's room in a service station. They were very earthy.
He ought to have been with me at Christmas. I, together with several other officers, went over to Petersburg, got drunk and f***ed out. We stayed 2 days and nights. You ought to have seen me going to bed with a gal. I'll tell you, it's a heap better than sleeping with a man.
I hope you'll be in Charleston when this letter reaches you. You will have lots of f***ing, I hope. There's 4 whorehouses here where a man can get a single jump for $3, $5 for all night.
Steamy letters, however, were not the only mail soldiers looked forward to. There was also salacious material of a much more commercial sort. The large groups of soldiers living together constituted an easy market for purveyors of vice. Several New York City-based companies, including Richards & Roche and G.S. Hoskins & Company, mailed catalogs featuring erotic material directly to the men in the field.
It was a vast industry. You could buy pornographic pictures, you could buy pornographic novels, you could buy condoms. Almost anything you could think of was for sale.
Some of the most popular products included hand-tinted nude photographs and racy dime store novels such as The Beautiful Creole of Havana or Confessions of a Washington Belle. The easy availability of pornographic literature so offended one Union officer that he wrote a long letter to President Abraham Lincoln expressing his outrage.
Captain Tousley was a Union captain who was very upset by some newspaper advertisements he'd seen for racy novels and racy pictures. And he cut out a clipping from a newspaper and sent it to Abraham Lincoln, saying, "Dear Mr. President, this kind of thing is undermining the morals of our soldiers, and I want you to do something about it." And we found no record of Lincoln responding to this. I think with a major war and a number of political crises, he probably had his hands full without worrying about the pornography industry.
By the spring of 1863, the once beautiful city of Richmond, Virginia, had become mired in the vices common to war zones.
The best source for understanding the seedier side of wartime Richmond is the Wartime Richmond newspapers. There's an editorial in May of 1862 that comes to mind complaining about both male and female prostitutes running at large in Richmond, in carriages, smirking, smiling, and winking lasciviously.
Even the city's most distinguished citizens seemed to lose their moral bearings. One local prostitute, known only as Clara A., wrote a diary in which she included some particularly telling notes about some of her exclusive clientele.
General Limpy, he must do the undressing. The Maryland governor, do it bending over, bark sometimes. The praying general was brought in today by Preacher H. He's rough and brutal. After I serviced him, he dropped to his knees and asked God to forgive me for my sins.
Some people think the diary is a hoax. I've talked with one person who actually saw the diary, and he claims that it seemed absolutely real. That person has now passed away, so what we have is something which can never be documented, but is a fascinating ground for speculation.
On the other side of the coin was Sally Buck Preston, a genuine society girl looking for love and romance in the squalor of Richmond. For Sally, the war had brought dozens of dashing Confederate officers into her life. She had her pick, and she didn't hesitate to choose. But being chosen by Sally was a decidedly mixed blessing.
Those soldiers that she became most attached to had an unhappy knack of getting killed off. It began right at the beginning of the war. One South Carolina officer who she was attached to was killed in a duel. Bradfute Warwick, who was from Richmond, was shot and killed at the Battle of Gaines's Mill in 1862.
In just 18 months, Sally had lost 3 lovers. Now her curse was being tested again by one of the Confederacy's most celebrated generals. His name was John Bell Hood. A tall, lanky officer from Kentucky, Hood gained fame leading the fabled Texas Brigade during the South's victory at Gaines's Mill. Hood was a bona fide hero, and he had his eye on Buck Preston.
Hood moved in the same social circles as did Buck Preston. He rubbed elbows with Jefferson Davis and his family and with many of the Confederate cabinet members. And in that way, he came to know Buck Preston fairly well, and the two of them became an item, regardless of Buck Preston's doleful record with her boyfriends in the past.
In the midst of their courtship, Hood was ordered back on campaign. Would Sally Preston's curse strike again? Only time would tell. But first, the Confederacy would find itself rocked by one of the greatest sex scandals of the war.
Earl Van Dorn. He was the epitome of the cavalryman of the day. Brave, bold, in combat, fearless, reckless.
Confederate General Earl Van Dorn was one of the South's most renowned cavalry officers. He was also one of its most controversial and notorious.
The general was known as a rake. He had had weakness with women. During the war, a widow, 24-year-old widow, had told him, she said, "You need to stay away from the women while this war is going on." He said, "My God, madam, I can't do that. I hate all men. If it were not for the women, I wouldn't even be fighting the war. And besides, I wouldn't be speaking to you now if I took your advice."
The 40-year-old Van Dorn began the Civil War as one of the Confederacy's most promising officers. His daring raid on a huge federal supply base in Holly Springs, Mississippi, was a major factor in stopping Union General Ulysses S. Grant's winter campaign of 1862. The following spring, Van Dorn established temporary headquarters in Spring Hill, Tennessee. In this house, then owned by the White family, the general began an illicit affair with a local woman. Her name was Jessie Peters, the wife of Dr. George Peters. Conveniently, the doctor was often away on business.
Jessie Peters would ride up to General Van Dorn's first headquarters. In her carriage, walked through the front door, asked to see the general. Mrs. White says she would bring him down. She says, "Never mind, I'll go up there." And stayed with the general in his headquarters for over an hour. And this occurred again, next time for over 2 hours.
Van Dorn's behavior offended the sensibilities of his hosts, and he was asked to leave. The general relocated his headquarters to another home nearby. Here, Van Dorn continued his affair with Jessie Peters. But rumors were beginning to fly, and Jessie's husband discovered the illicit relationship. On May 7, 1863, Dr. Peters rode over to Van Dorn's headquarters to confront the general.
Dr. Peters said that he would not kill him if he would write a letter of apology and guilt. And Van Dorn said that this would hurt the cause as well as his reputation. And Dr. Peters was not happy with this, and Van Dorn, obviously not even looking at him, said, "Take the door, you damn puppy, or I'll throw you out." At this stage, Dr. Peters pulled out a pistol.
Dr. George Peters immediately fled to the north. He maintained that the general had violated the sanctity of his marriage. He was never brought to trial. Van Dorn's shocking death was front-page news throughout the South and the North.
Needless to say, he placed personal gain over his command. He did not lead by example. One newspaper would write that wine and women ruined him, as it has ruined many others.
The summer of 1863 was a turning point in the Civil War. The Union Army achieved a great victory at Gettysburg, but down south it was losing a different kind of battle. In the military-occupied cities of Nashville and Memphis, the Army faced a terrible problem. The rapid spread of venereal disease was disabling large numbers of soldiers.
The military commanders are trying to run a war. To have a war, you need soldiers. And at one point, maybe a quarter of the soldiers in places like Memphis and Nashville were sick with venereal disease. Well, even before they marched out of town to fight the Confederates, they had 25% casualties. That's of a real concern to a general.
The Union commander in Nashville was the first to act. In the summer of 1863, General R.S. Granger issued Provost Order Number 21. By virtue of this order, Nashville became the first city in America to effectively legalize the world's oldest profession.
Well, the Army would say it was not legalized. What they simply did was to regulate something that was happened already. No one changed the laws making prostitution legal. What they did was to take something that was already up and running and regulate it in a way to keep the soldiers healthy.
Within months, it was clear the radical experiment was working. The number of infected soldiers decreased dramatically, from 40% to 4%. This success did not go unnoticed by the Union commanders in Memphis.
They sent an inspector there from the Sanitary Commission who came back and said the program is working. And so they set up a similar program with a public hospital for diseased prostitutes, military hospital for diseased soldiers, mandatory licensing, mandatory inspection about once a week. And with that, they were able to control the epidemic of disease.
The program was also a success financially. In 3 years, 134 prostitutes paid over $6,400 in registration fees. This generated almost $4,000 in profit for the Union Army. Unfortunately, regulating prostitution only curbed disease. According to the Army's own records, it did not stop sexual misconduct. Court-martial proceedings reveal many cases of gross improprieties committed by officers in both armies. These often read more like today's tabloids than official military documents.
One of my favorite court-martials is of a man that I call the Starbucks Bandit. This was Dr. William Scott, who was in charge of Hospital Number 8 at Nashville. And he had found a way to steal $5,000 worth of coffee. And he sold this, and he used the money to support his 2 mistresses, both of whom are prostitutes and both of whom are described in the records. And they basically asked him to leave the Army. Another New York colonel had his regiment down at Pensacola, and he assembled his troops and said, if you put together a fund, I will put on a regimental party. And he put on quite a party there at Pensacola. The party lasted for 3 days, and at the end of the 3 days, 25% of the troops had venereal disease and 30% were absent without leave. That's a man who knows how to do a party.
But few in the Union Army partied quite like this man, General H. Judson Kilpatrick, a brash, daring cavalry commander.
He had very few vices. He did not play cards. He did not drink alcohol, which is to his credit. His vice was women.
Kilpatrick gained a notorious reputation for always having women traveling with him. One such companion was named Alice.
He said she was a northern schoolteacher that was stranded behind the lines, but Captain Miller, 5th Ohio Cavalry, would state that most of the soldiers knew that this was not true, or she was there for other purposes.
Those other purposes no doubt included sex. Later, Kilpatrick went so far as to bring a pregnant woman with him on campaign, dressed in a soldier's uniform and nicknamed Charlie. But Kilpatrick's womanizing didn't seem to affect his career. In 1865, he was promoted to Major General of Volunteers. After the war, he received a presidential appointment as Minister to Chile. By contrast, Confederate General John Bell Hood's obsession with one woman, Richmond debutante Sally Preston, would nearly bring him to ruin. By the fall of 1863, some of Sally Preston's friends were beginning to wonder if being her lover was a terrible curse. Several of her ardent suitors had already died in the war, and now the curse was nipping quite literally at the limbs of her latest admirer, the dashing John Bell Hood. After meeting Sally, he went to the Battle of Gettysburg and lost the use of his right arm. 2 months later, in the Battle of Chickamauga, Hood lost his left leg. Upon hearing the news, socialite Mary Chestnut said the obvious to her good friend Buck.
Hood was always lucky until he met you.
Hood returned to Richmond to recover from his disfiguring wounds. There, through the winter of 1864, he rekindled his romance with Sally Preston.
He and Buck Preston did apparently become engaged, although it wasn't an especially formal event. The two of them had singled each other out as their special other, and they did become engaged in February of 1864.
However, before any wedding could ensue, the war called Hood once again. Confederate President Jefferson Davis desperately needed commanders. So, despite his wounds, Hood left Richmond with high hopes, both for helping the Confederacy win the war and for winning the heart of Sally Preston. While the heterosexual exploits of Civil War soldiers and citizens have been well documented, accounts of homosexual activity are fairly rare.
We have one in which 2 officers were court-martialed for conduct unbecoming, in which they were having an argument in the company streets, the corridor between the tents, and it sounds like an argument between 2 queens. One captain was saying, well, you never loved me anyway, and the lieutenant said, well, you've been looking at these other guys. And just from the verbatim testimony, you can see these 2 guys walking up and down, pouting and sulking and calling each other feminine kinds of nicknames.
Curiously, significantly more cases involving homosexuality have been discovered in the war's naval records.
In the Union Navy court-martials, which we've just started looking at, we found at least a dozen trials, usually either described as sodomy or crimes against nature. And one of the things the Navy did back then was to enlist boys aged 10, 11, 12, this kind of thing. And for men who are interested in young boys, so-called chickens, this was a natural, excuse the expression, breeding ground.
Perhaps the war's most well-known homosexual was the era's most celebrated poet, Walt Whitman. Whitman worked as a volunteer nurse in Washington, D.C., helping tend to the thousands of wounded soldiers.
Anyone who would go into a Civil War hospital to do nursing ought to be sainted. They were absolutely awful. Whitman would go into these hospitals and help and do the nursing care, bathe people's brows, write letters for them, read to them, this kind of thing. And I suspect he found a few sexual friends there. From Whitman's own diary, he liked rough trade. He liked streetcar motormen, he liked stevedores, dock workers, this kind of thing.
Whitman wrote openly about his sexual preferences. His wartime journal recounts dozens of encounters with men.
Peter, large, strong-boned young fellow, driver. I liked his refreshing wickedness. William Culver, boy in Bath, aged 18. David Wilson, night of October 11th, 62. Walking up from Nidda. Slept with me.
For Sally Preston and her fiancé, General John Bell Hood, their future together was much like that of the Confederacy. Doomed. Hood's return to action as commander of the Army of Tennessee was marked by a series of bloody defeats that left his army decimated and his reputation in tatters. Then, upon his return to Richmond in January of 1865, Hood was spurned by the woman he loved. Sally's friend Mary Chestnut wrote about the end of the affair.
The Hood melodrama is over, though the curtain has not fallen on the final scene. When that style of enthusiasm is on the wane, the rapidity of its extinction is miraculous. It's like the snuffing out of a candle, one moment white, then gone forever.
In the spring of 1865, General John Bell Hood left Richmond. He never saw Sally Preston again. Both eventually married other people. In 1879, Hood died of yellow fever. The following year, Sally Preston died at the age of 38, following an operation of an undisclosed nature. The Civil War was effectively over when Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Union General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865. Over the next several months, soldiers on both sides left their posts and went home. In Memphis, the city returned to civilian control, and prostitution was once again outlawed.
The regulation was only specifically for the Army itself. So when the Army left and the government came out of Memphis, it was the local government that took over. So they just didn't continue with the regulation.
In the decades following the Civil War, Victorian-era sensibilities censored much of the sexual nature of the four-year struggle. Surviving relatives often destroyed any sexual references found in the diaries or letters left behind by both soldiers and civilians. History books and battlefield interpretations stressed the war's heroes and tactics. It is only recently that scholars have turned their attention to this human side of the conflict. As these little-known stories and little-seen evidence come into the light, a new appreciation and understanding can be had for the real men and women who fought, died, and loved in America's Civil War.